Hey, what's up? So, a quick disclaimer before moving to the run itself. The purpose of this video is mainly to show what to pay attention to when pugging as a healer, when to prepare for damage, some tips and also considerations to be had, and what to expect the moment you play with people with little to no communication. As mentioned previously, this is more of a general guide for pugging and not necessarily a discipline and routing guide. Here are my stats and also the build I used in this dungeon. Currently running my City of Threats build, which focuses a bit more on survivability and not so much on damage, while also having access to Mass Dispel due to this week's Salatat debuff affix. Now enough yapping and let's go straight to the video. Alright, so before tossing the key in, the group agreed to do what most groups do, which is to pull the entire hallway and Lust. As a healer, you need to be ready and prepared for this, whether it is by placing HOTS on everyone, get resources, or spend some cooldowns. In my case, Rapture, while the tank gathers everything, is more than enough. All this while doing my regular healing rotation. So after shielding everyone, using the power infusion, I pain up myself. I didn't expect to get dispelled right away, but I guess having 2 curse dispellers is something pretty useful in this dungeon. It can still be done without curse dispels, but the group has to be a bit more proactive with their defensive cooldowns, especially when getting 2 or more applications. Probably if you're doing like 12s or maybe depending on the size of the pool, on more organized groups, you usually pull bigger, so having a curse dispeller becomes way more important than it is on small pools like this one. And I actually have another clip of an 11 where we missed the timer by literally 5 seconds and the only curse dispeller we had was an evoker with his 2-day cooldown. And the issues we had there had nothing to do with the pulse with the curse debuffs. So, yeah, definitely nice to have, mandatory, not at the range where this dungeon is puggable anyway. And Shamans are even more OP this week since they can actually have their poison totem to clear every wave of the Salatat debuff. In any case, I still do sometimes use Mass Dispel when you can't afford to rely on someone else to react quickly in potentially dangerous situations where the debuffs must be cleansed ASAP. Okay, so there's one thing we didn't do this run, is that after killing either side, it's usually a good idea to pull the 2 golems in the middle. After taking them down, the RPS starts rolling, and in the meantime, the group can clear the remaining side pack and pull the boss right after. In my opinion, this dungeon gets a worse reputation than it should. Like any other key, knowledge is key when navigating these dungeons, and know when to use which cooldowns. Like any other DPS plans their damage for packs, you should do the same for specific pulls or mechanics. The main idea is for you to plan ahead, so the dungeon basically becomes a script you need to follow and tell yourself, alright, so in this pull I'm using this cooldown, then the next one I don't really need to use anything, and so on. Alright, so now let's talk about the debuff, better known as the brain check. Tanks get the debuff after they get hit by the Seismic Smash. You do not dispel the debuff right away. Now for the first application of the Seismic Smash, the tank should usually use a defensive cooldown. In my case I just gave them pains up just in case. The debuff is just a dot that doesn't really do that much damage to tanks, but what you do with the debuff is to dispel it when the boss starts casting Seismic Smash. And why dispel there? Because by doing so it leaves another debuff that reduces damage taken by 60% in order to survive the new Seismic Smash, which is also a tank buster. And just like that, our tank takes no damage. A cool strat that every tank should do, which isn't shown in the video, is that the tank can run into a stone pillar to break it and apply 1 stack of the dot that can be healed passively, making the healer's life easier, and that way, realistically, you won't need to use a big healing cooldown, since you will never go past 2 stacks. Now, when pugging, as you can see in the video, it can't be expected that every tank does that, so my advice is that you should save your defensive cooldowns or healing cooldowns for the lasers that come before the boss reaches full energy, which will most likely leave you with at least 3 stacks, followed by another instance of group-wide damage very soon. And from that point onwards is just rinse and repeat. Make sure to aim the beams at the pillars, and if the boss is close to dying, try to keep at least one healing CD available. This last part is because what tanks usually do is to do a big pull right after the boss. On 45, the big ad does a ton of damage, so if you don't have anything at your disposal, you're going to have a bad time. And it's also possible that the DPS won't have any defensives either, because they already used them on the boss as well. Something you can do is to type defensives in the chat, so you can potentially save an important cooldown for the following pull. As you can see, we also missed a pillar, so yeah, totally not my fault. But yeah, 1 or 2 pillars bursting there, it doesn't really matter, it's very healable and honestly even expected in a PUG setting. As the boss dies, try to not be close to any entrance, because you might even end up face pulling, talking from experience. Now, our tank didn't go for the big pull this time, but it's always very important that you should be prepared for those specific cases, when you don't know what the tank is going to pull and you don't want to be caught off guard with your pants down. Now, even though this pull may seem a little slow, the tank is actually the one in danger in this hallway that we are going into. So he probably knows the way he wants to manage the pulls, and you're going to see that's exactly what he does. The mobs on this hallway apply a damage taken debuff, get to the point where the tank gets straight up one-shot. And as for everyone else in the group, you need to watch out for the lava cannon, which has a really weird angle, so you definitely need to exaggerate your movement so you can know 100% that you won't get hit by the frontal. And the other thing that you need to worry about is the dot. It does heavy ticking damage and you have to do your best to keep that person alive. If it goes on you, make sure to use a personal in order to minimize the damage that it does to you. Giving the druid a quick movement boost to make sure he doesn't die again. And that's one thing about dungeons in this expansion. You don't really need to do big pulls. As long as you navigate the dungeon clean, you should be able to time them anyway. Now the tank decided not to pull the 2 packs together here, probably because he didn't want to deal with the debuff, or at least he didn't want to risk it, which is actually respectable. And something I personally do, and at least I try to do as often as possible, is to keep one caster on focus when there are casters in the pack and target the other one, so you can track which casts are going off in the case you need to pop a cooldown on a person in particular or to focus someone. On some keys, getting double casted on means death, so definitely something to keep in mind if you need to use an external or land an instant heal in between casts, because either your interrupts or CCs are on cooldown. And that's even more important in dungeons like Necrotic Wake, where throw flesh, which you can't even interrupt, you have to use a CC, it takes away like 70% of your health. Quite an eventful pull, nothing really happened, just avoiding the swirls on the ground, and yeah, interrupt the casts, which don't really do that much damage, and this pull that we are running into is pretty much the same. I just decided to use these cooldowns, Pains Up, Rapture, mainly because we are not gonna need them until we get to the boss, so we might as well just use them now. That way I can just tunnel and focus on my damage / healing rotation without having to stop. And all of the following pulls, pretty much up to the second boss, are basically the same. 1 or 2 casters that are very manageable, and some melee mobs that aren't really relevant unless you are the tank. And since these pools are pretty much the same, we're just going to speed this up until we get to the second boss. Now this boss isn't as difficult as it used to be when the expansion came out. So now what happens with this boss is that the overlaps don't really occur as often, and honestly everything that they do is very healable. All you need to worry about is the vents. The vents, and everyone to be as high HP as possible before the next crescendo. Avoid the frontal using the same logic that we used in the trash before this boss. And always look at the timers. Always be prepared for the vents, since you will have to move a lot to get to the safe spot. Crescendo is where you want to use your damage reduction cooldowns. Every way you can to minimize the damage taken, whether it be Aura Mastery, Rapture, Barrier, Stone Skin Totem, whatever you have. Try to find a rotation for your class. In my case, as this priest, I usually use Rapture on the first one, then Barrier on the second one, and then if the boss goes long enough, I can use Rapture once again. And if, as a healer, you are also in charge of the range interrupt on the boss, remember that it always jumps to the closest side. Now, as for when to use the big healing cooldowns that increase your output, pay attention to the occasional overlap with Crescendo and Exhausting Vents, which the ideal moment to use them is there, although most healers can simply deal with it with their normal rotation. And as you can see, there's nothing out of the ordinary. The fight is pretty scripted. It's important for you to find your flow with your cooldowns, and yeah, it should be cake. Sadly, we can't take the cart here because of the mech that's patrolling right now, so we got a pretty bad timing. However, it doesn't really matter. It's a very short walk. And the following pulls on this hallway are the ones that you need to put the most attention as a healer. You need to prepare yourself. You see that I started shielding everyone here with Rapture, and on top of that using my healing rotation in order to survive this big AoE that can be rough most of the times, especially if you don't have anything, which is why I was a little worried at the beginning after the first boss, but we just didn't end up doing it, so it's all good. Some tanks that I've seen pull the pack that we just killed into these, and that's actually very dangerous because if you get the AoE and the healer was unprepared, maybe you can survive the big AoE, but if you are unprepared and on top of that a piercing wail goes off, then it's pretty much a wipe. As a healer, you need to put lots of attention on the speaker and make sure to only interrupt it when it goes on you, because if it goes on someone else and that person gets silenced, you can just dispel it, it doesn't matter. But if it goes on you, then you're screwed. And yeah, also dodge the swirlies. Drop the feather all the way back for the druid to catch up with the group quicker. And now, since there is no communication, I don't know if he's just gonna walk him a little bit, this pool right here, and then go straight to the next pool where you actually need to use your cooldowns there. And yeah, I didn't know if I could use my Mind Blast here, so I was hesitant, and better safe than sorry. I'd rather have all my cooldowns on the worst case scenario than optimizing a little bit on my damage in the best case scenario. Once again, preparation and knowing the pulse is key. This big mob usually does Shadow Claw into the AoE, and then Shadow Claw again. Then you have to wait a little bit, and if the mob is still alive, he's going to Shadow Claw again, and then you know that the AoE is coming. So you have like 1 or 2 seconds of grace to get ready for what's about to happen. These pulls with the elementals, if they don't get stunned, they usually drop the shards right off the bat. So always keep an eye on the tutorials as soon as the pull starts. And there you see Shadow Claw into AoE. At this point I noticed that they were pretty on point with kicks, so I stopped paying that much attention to the casts. And on top of that, the shaman was pretty sharp with the poison totem. Right, so what you need to do on this boss, when the orbs come out, you need to grab one stack, only one. And before the intermission, you need to grab the second orb. Also, the first instance of damage here and the breaking of the first shard can be a pretty difficult to heal, I guess. But what you need to do is, that's the moment you have to use your cooldown. In theory, some groups, what they do, when they are more organized, they let the DPS take the orbs and the healer won't take any orb. And during the intermission, that's when they use their healing cooldowns. But when you're pugging, you don't know if the DPS are actually saving cooldowns for that phase. So right before the intermission, you grab the second orb to refresh the application, and you should be able to heal that phase without even using major cooldowns. And only save your major cooldowns for after the intermission, and you'll be able to manage the shards exploding with your healing cooldowns, even though you don't have the buff, which is very helpful if you get double shard explosions. Sometimes it's not even the fault of the DPS, because the shards, at times, they spawn right next to each other. But it shouldn't be as much of an issue if you actually prepared for that. In my case, Rapture or a Mastery, you can probably heal everything off with Revival, so yeah, try to do it if you can. Sadly, I can only use Raptured because Bearer isn't really as reliable when the group is all spread apart. But I try to have my Mindbender and Mind Blast for those windows. Now we simply grab the second orb, or maybe not. Alright, so let's hope better is enough. Thankfully the DH took notice of that and dropped Darkness right on top of us. We have to do the best that we can to keep the group alive while hoping that the shield breaks soon enough. Now once again we put Rapture on everybody before the next breaking of shards. And look, we got to 2 stacks, but even then, nobody died. So yeah, it's not the end of the world if you get 2 breaks, but yeah, the third one is a full group wipe. Now we're moving to the last section of the dungeon, and at this point the worst is pretty much over, so it's just a matter of not messing up the easy stuff, like getting frontaled by these charging fellas, or chain pulling the big elementals, and then it's free. And here the tanks head back. For some reason, me and the Boom King didn't know much what he was talking about. Maybe he was afraid that we would end up baiting these two mobs into the room and end up pulling the patrol. And now he actually does something that I didn't know you could do, which is to pull the big elemental separately. Look, slow and steady wins the race. We are not even running a meta comp, so as long as you have capable players, all these keys can be done. Maybe at the very top end of the player base, where you are actually pushing 13s, 14s and such, or if you're pushing for the season title. Otherwise you can just play whatever you want, as long as you know what you're doing. Now usually this pull with the elemental is a little more problematic, so you definitely need to pay attention to both casters and follow the same rule that we mentioned earlier. But yeah, right now it's free, but this isn't usually the case. And that's the thing with pugging, man. As Forrest Gump would say, it's like a box of chocolates. Sometimes you get people like who play like headless chickens, and some other times you get gamers, like in this case. Now don't do what I just did, which is healing the tank while he was trying to pull while LOSing. But thankfully I'm a priest, so I just pressed my fade panic button, so we got out of jail for free. point we are hoping for the elemental not to use the AoE again, because otherwise we're dead, or maybe I'll just have to be forced to use a defensive, but we managed to finish it off before that. As for the last boss, as long as people don't delay their debuff clear for longer than one portal rotation, nobody should be taking significant damage. The circles that you get don't really do that much damage either, so whenever you are in the middle of the room with the boss in range of everyone, as long as everyone is topped off before spreading to drop the puddle, there shouldn't be anything to worry about. However, there is one overlap that we'll see, which always happens at a certain time. Pretty much like the second boss on Dawnbreaker, where you get the dot and the circles at the same time. It's at that point where you should use your healing CDs if possible, and everyone should pop a defensive. And if you look at the timer, this is when the overlap happens. So we make sure everyone is topped off with shields, and now all you have to do is to clear your debuff. At this point you get the second overlap, which at this point you might as well just use whatever you have left since the boss is almost dead, assuming you see yourself dropping low. And just like that we managed to complete the dungeon with a couple minutes left. Let me know what you think of the video, whether you like it or you think it was ass, if you learned something or if you think it was a waste of time. I'll appreciate the criticism in order to improve the format for the next time. My Raider.io profile will be in the description below, and thank you so much for watching and good luck with your keys.